All right, let's start chapter 9 in Bio 157, which deals with muscle tissue. So in this chapter, we're going to do a deep dive into muscle, the structure of muscle cells, and then how muscle cells contract. All right. So the first thing we have to understand, though, is that a muscle cell is part of a muscle, and around that muscle is connective tissue. So let's take a look at connective tissue within a skeletal muscle. So a skeletal muscle is composed of not just skeletal muscle tissue, but there's also connective tissue, nervous tissue, and blood also found there. So let's look at the types of connective tissue in a muscle. So the first is the epimysium, which we see here. So as you kind of look at this picture, it's built kind of just like a nerve, if you remember back from there. So all the way around on the outside, we have the epimysium. So the epimysium is connective tissue that closely surrounds a skeletal muscle. So it goes all the way around, is the epimysium. All right, so it is made of dense collagenous connective tissue. What we see is we see a grouping of these muscle cells. So a grouping of those muscle cells is known as a fasciculus or fascicle. All right, and then we're going to have connective tissue around that fasciculus or fascicle, and that is known as the perimysium. So that's connective tissue that surrounds bundles of muscle fibers. All right, and so each one of these is an individual muscle cell, also known as a muscle fiber. So a muscle fiber, muscle cell, same thing. I will use those terms interchangeably. Lastly here is the endomysium, which is connective tissue that goes around that individual muscle cell. All right, so let's take a look at fascia. Fascia is a general term for connective tissue sheets within the body. All right, so if we go to this, like this cross section through a leg, all right. So looking at types of fascia, the first is called muscular or deep fascia. So this is connective tissue between adjacent muscles. So that's this stuff right here. It's muscular or deep fascia. So this compartmentalizes individual muscles or groups of muscles. So they help them work together or separately from other muscles. Next is superficial fascia, which is what we see here on the edge. So you see skin and then that superficial fascia. This is connective tissue between the muscles and the skin. And it may contain adipose tissue. I don't know why it says may. It does contain adipose tissue. All right, let's take a look at forms of attachment. So one form of attachment is direct attachment. And that's where the collagen fibers of the epimysium are continuous with the periosteum. Now, if you remember, periosteum is connective tissue that surrounds bone. So up here in the pectoralis major, we just go from epimysium to the periosteum very quickly right there. Next is an indirect attachment. And that's where the collagen fibers of the epimysium become a tendon. All right? So, and then the tendon becomes continuous with the periosteum. So here's the epimysium around the muscle cell, or around the muscle, becomes a tendon, which then becomes a periosteum. All right? Now, this can do a couple other things. It could also become an aponeurosis. And this is a sheet of connective tissue that connects adjacent muscles. So instead of going muscle to bone, now we're going from muscle to muscle. And I know on this picture you don't see it all, but this is an aponeurosis, because this will go from the external oblique on one side of our body to the external oblique on the other side of our body. All right? So that's one form. Another form is what is known as a retinaculum. A retinaculum is a band of connective tissue that surrounds many muscles. And we see these around our ankles. We also get them around our wrists. And this is what leads to people having carpal tunnel. Because what happens is you get inflammation underneath that retinaculum. It's hard to get that inflammation out. So what they do in a carpal tunnel surgery is they just come along and they cut that retinaculum, relieving that pressure in there. All right, so now let's take a look at skeletal muscle structure. So we're going to talk about skeletal muscles first, and then we're going to go back and briefly talk about cardiac and smooth muscle at the end of this chapter and the little differences between those muscle types. So let's look at a skeletal muscle fiber, as once again is the same thing as a skeletal muscle cell. So for some reason, they renamed all these parts, all right? So first is a sarcolemma. So this is a sarcolemma. So that is a muscle cell's plasma membrane, is a sarcolemma. Just if you break this word down, sarco means flesh, lemma means covering. So a flesh covering. So part of the sarcolemma is these tubes that penetrate into the cell. And these things right here are called T-tubules. And they're going to be very important for muscle contraction, which we'll talk about later. Next is the sarcoplasm, and that's everything that's in here is within the sarcoplasm. The sarcoplasm is a muscle cell cytoplasm. It contains thousands of mitochondria, because mitochondria produce energy for the cell. They also contain an abundance of glycogen. If you remember, glycogen is a storage form of glucose. They also contain myofibrils, which each one of these things is a myofibril. Now, there's typically a lot more of these myofibrils than what we see here, just showing us 5 of these. So the myofibril is the myofibril are the contractile fibers within a muscle cell. And we're going to spend a little bit more time on those in a little bit. All right? It also contains myoglobin. And myoglobin is a protein that stores oxygen in the muscle cells. All right? So we'll come back and we'll talk about myoglobin a little bit later, but it's similar to hemoglobin in that effect. Next is the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So all this in yellow is trying to show the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This is the muscle cell's smooth endoplasmic reticulum. And one of the things to note about here is it lies on either side of that T-tubule. So it lies on either side of the T-tubule. All right? And what's really important about it is it stores calcium ions, which are, once again, going to be very important when we get to muscle contraction. All right, so let's look at these myofibrils. So myofibrils there, these are the contractile fibers within a muscle cell. So let's look at their anatomy. This is showing one coming out at us. All right, and let's go a little further. So if we just take a little piece of this is just showing a little piece of that myofibril. And what we see here is we see a couple of filaments. The larger filament here in green is known as the myosin myofilament. And this is primarily made of myosin proteins. So if we go to this picture here, so this right there is the same thing as this here. These are trying to show those myosin myofilament, or those myosin proteins individually. So you can kind of see that they are golf club shaped, and these golf clubs go at several different angles here. All right? So next is, we can see it right there, that is the actin myofilament. So the actin myofilament is made of actin, which are these ball-shaped proteins. And so it has 2 rows of these guys, and it's twisted, so they kind of wind around. And on the actin protein, they have these active sites right here. And those active sites are going to bind to the head on that myosin. All right, so that's what's going to happen when we get to contraction. But what prevents the myosin from just grabbing onto that actin is this protein complex. So we see 2 other proteins here on the actin myofilament. One is trypomyosin, shown here in blue, and the other is troponin, shown there in red. All right? So what these 2 proteins do together is they block the active site. All right? So that, by blocking the active site, that prevents the myosin from binding to the actin. All right? So we call this the troponin-trypomyosin complex. All right? Now, one thing about troponin, which we're going to talk about a little bit later as well, but troponin is going to bind to calcium ions. Once again, it's going to be very important when we talk about muscular contraction. All right, so let's look at how we make these striations. So if we go to the next picture here, this is showing this in black and white. You're seeing these lighter lines, darker lines, lighter lines. All right? So these darker lines here are known as the A band. All right? And the lighter areas are known as the I bands. So we have the A band, then the I band. All right? Now, just a helpful reminder on this, A bands, A has, dark has an A in it, and light has an I in it. Don't know that that's how they were named, but it's an easy way to remember these things. Within the A band, we're seeing a little area known as the H zone. All right? So, how is it the A band is dark and the I band is light? This has everything to do with where the myosin is located. Wherever we have myosin, so if we go back here, here's where the myosin is. That is where the A band is. This area where there is no myosin, that is the I band. So A band, I band, A band, I band. So the same thing that we see over here. So where that A band is, that's where we have myosin. All right? No myosin, we're in the I band. Now, what you'll also notice within the A band here is we have the actin overlapping a little bit in that area. But we have a small zone in the A band in which there is no actin, and that is known as the H zone. Sometimes referred to as the H band as well. All right? So this is a band within the A band that has no actin. Now within the I band, you're going to see this zigzag line, but it's actually a disc-shaped structure, and that is known as a Z-disc. And you can see all the actin myofilaments attached to that Z-disc. All right? So, lastly here is a sarcomere. So we go from this Z-disc to that Z-disc, that is one sarcomere. We go from that Z-disc to that Z-disc, that is another sarcomere. So if we go down a myofibril, you'll see it's just one sarcomere after the next. So a sarcomere is a structural and functional unit of a myofibril. So structural, I already said, it's one sarcomere after the next. Functional, when we are going to look at muscle contraction, all we have to do in that muscle contraction is look at what's taking place within one sarcomere. If it's taking place within that one sarcomere, it's taking place throughout that whole myofibril, which is taking place throughout that whole muscle cell, which is taking place throughout that muscle. All right? And you can kind of see what's going to happen here if you just kind of look at it. These myosin proteins are going to grab onto the actin, they're going to pull on the actin, and that's going to bring those Z discs closer together.